Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Ron Lake. I'm from Lake Partners. I'll be today's moderator for this roundtable event. And first, a thank you to Stephen Miniman, helping to organize today's proceedings. This is part of an ongoing series, and we're very happy that our sponsor is AltFest. Thank you to Jeff Tarrant and Howard Mason and Julie Silcox for all their support. And this is actually an historic event. Let me just turn it over to Howard Mason for a second. He can talk about what's going on today.
Thank you very much, Ron. Well, I'd just like to say that AltFest is very proud to sponsor the Greenwich Roundtable in this event. It's in keeping with our mission of providing education to hedge fund investors about goings on in the hedge fund industry. And it's particularly timely that Larry Feinberg from Oracle Partners is able to join us. I should just tell you all that for the first time, we're webcasting the Greenwich Roundtable. And what that means is that a video record of today's proceedings will be available exclusively on the AltFest website for members of our community of hedge fund investors and managers to keep a record of. Thank you very much, Ron.
Thank you. Thank you. Today's topic is biological innovation and politics, the future of healthcare. 2 years ago, we had a session here on a very similar topic, the scientific and technological transformation of healthcare. And in fact, Larry Feinberg was one of our speakers, one of the panelists at that event. And I want to quote something that Larry said at that time. We are just, don't worry, we are just at the beginning. The pace of discovery is accelerating. The genome is being sequenced. Is an exciting time. Here we are 2 years later, and what was an eye-opening statement 2 years ago almost sounds like an understatement today. There have been tremendous developments, which both Larry and Craig Venter, who will introduce shortly, will be updating us on. The reaction to these developments has been tremendously varied, to put it mildly, in the area of genetically modified crops, for example. We have, on the one hand, a vociferous outcry of affluent consumers, primarily in Western Europe, alarmed about potential unknown health effects of so-called frankenfoods. On the other hand, the quiet desperation of poorer developing countries ready to grab onto anything new that promises to create more efficient and productive ways of feeding people. In the area of healthcare, human healthcare, the reaction again has been very varied. Let me just start. I have to refer to this interesting item that appeared on the Bloomberg a couple weeks ago. I'll just read it to you. A Canadian futurist known as Dr. Tomorrow said he has applied in the U.S. for a trademark on his own DNA to protect his identity from being exploited, the Canadian Press News Agency reported. Greg Hodgkin, 79, told a gathering of about 1,000 scientists yesterday he doesn't want others using his DNA without compensating him. If Hodgkin can't get a trademark from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, he plans to apply to any of 236 other countries. That's one approach. Another reaction we've had to this whole topic came up about 6 weeks ago. We had Larry Summers here, and actually Steve asked a question of him, which was if the 20th century was the century of the computer, perhaps the next century would be the century of biology. And Steve asked him what he thought the policy implications of that would be. And Larry Summers said that he really knew nothing about it, and then went on to give a very interesting, very cogent explanation of what the policy implications, in fact, would be of genetic developments, ranging from questions about whether it be for only the rich or for everybody, whether it would affect how people get insurance or can't get insurance. And we all sat here and said, "Ooh, very interesting, such a well-informed man." And we should have stopped to think about why he was so well-informed, because a week later, or almost a week later, his boss, Bill Clinton, along with his buddy Tony Blair, issued a somewhat vague policy statement on this topic, which had the effect of touching off a really gut-wrenching slide in biotech stocks. I think actually contributed to the market correction we've been dealing with since then. Of course, Clinton went on to say he didn't really need to crash the market, but I guess I sort of makes Clinton and Blair kind of back in the Robin of the markets if we cast down Greenspan as Commissioner Gordon. You can almost see the sound effects in the background, kapow, oof. Anyway, be that as it may, we're here to hear from two people who really do have their finger on the pulse of what's happening in this arena. Let me first introduce formally Larry Feinberg, the founder of Oracle Partners, a healthcare hedge fund which he founded in '93. Previously, he was a principal of Odyssey Partners and began his career at Dean Witter Reynolds in 1980, and then went on to become the head of the healthcare group at Drexel, and was elected to the Institutional Investor All-American team for 7 consecutive years during that period. Craig Ventnor, next to Larry, is the president and chief scientific officer of Solera Genomics Group and the founder and former president of the Institute for Genomic Research, not-for-profit genomics research institution. Between '84 and the formation of GIGR in '92, Dr. Ventnor was a section chief and a lab chief in the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke at the NIH, and in 1990 developed a new strategy for gene discovery that revolutionized the biological sciences, and he's widely recognized as an early and important pioneer in this field. So let me turn over to Larry. You going to go speak first, then, or is this
still not okay?
Formally, yeah. Formally or informally?
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me for my second visit to the Greenwich Roundtable. I think it's a particularly timely presentation today, given the turmoil in the healthcare marketplace, particularly in the biotech marketplace, and what is clearly a tremendous lack of understanding. Nothing has changed fundamentally in the biotech sector during the last 12 months or 6 months for that matter, except for huge advances being made in particular by the company run by this man to my left, Dr. Ventnor. In fact, I think when we look back in the history books 10 years from now or 20 years from now, there will be written that Craig Ventnor is the man who's revolutionized healthcare and really changed the structure of how healthcare is delivered. I told Steve earlier, I feel like in biotech terms, I sort of feel like the opening act for the Rolling Stones. I'm going to be very brief in my comments because I think it's very important for Dr. Ventnor to speak, and I think Dr. Ventnor and I would like to open it up for questions because there does seem to be a lot of confusion about what is really going on in the healthcare marketplace and about some of the political issues related to genes, the patentability of genes, what products will be delivered from genes, what are they worth, who are the players, and that's something we'll get into in a little more detail, but again, we're going to be brief. For those of you who don't know, Ron gave a little bit of a background, but Oracle Investment Management is a firm that I started in 1993. It's really the predecessor fund. It started in 1989 at Odyssey Partners. We manage approximately $1 billion in assets, both on the hedge fund side and in private equity, solely in the healthcare industry. We were the first healthcare hedge fund. We've been able to generate 35% annualized net returns over the last 12 years. Because we are investors who do some trading, not traders who do some investing, it's been a little volatile, to say the least. But I am proud to say we've never had a down year over 12 years. And I think the opportunities in healthcare, as I'll show you graphically in a minute, are about as good as I've seen in the last 10 years or so. Our portfolio does focus in biotech because that's where I believe we're going to make the most money. Approximately 40% of our long positions are biotechnology. We do have about 25% in the pharmaceutical sector, an area where last year we were short. We have about 20% in healthcare services and internet-related healthcare companies and all. I think that's one of the areas of great revolution in healthcare, the internet. We have another 15% or so in medical devices. I've built an organization of 20 people to help me and to really share the responsibility of managing portfolios in healthcare. As I think the market has demonstrated during the last few weeks, it's not easy to invest in healthcare, particularly in biotechnology. People don't know what they own. And with me today are two of my partners, Dr. Rosemary Bazinet in the back. She's always hiding in the back corner when I give speeches. Rosemary was director of clinical research at Amgen. She's a very unique asset on Wall Street. She has a knowledge. She's both from a practical point of view as a practicing physician. And she was a staff oncologist at Dana-Farber, and as a researcher, again, she ran the clinical programs at Amgen. Also, Dr. David Blaustein to my left, recently saw the light. He was born again and joined Oracle Partners from Dwight Domena. David's a medical doctor. He's been on the street for 6 years. He used to be an emergency room physician at Yale. So he's our blood and guts guy, as we say. And he's been a tremendous asset and a tremendous value added to us. Also, Steve McMenamin's had a major role at Oracle Partners, both within the firm, helping us structure the firm, helping us market the firm, and he plays an ongoing role with us.
Like a mean cup of coffee, too.
That's true. That's true. I guess one thing I'd like to, just before we talk about the topic at hand, I think all of you know about the new Greenwich Hospital. And I just thought I'd relay a story to you about the new Greenwich Hospital I just heard recently. A patient that I think Dr. Ventnor knows, I think his name is Mr. Collins, I'm not quite sure. He went into the Greenwich Hospital emergency room recently having chest pains. And the doctors did a quick analysis of him and took him in, did an angiogram, brought him back down and said, Mr. Collins, we have both good news and bad news for you. The bad news is that you need a heart transplant. The good news is we have 3 candidates for you. One is a kayaker who I think his name is Mr. McMenamin. He just froze to death in northern Norway. He was able to import his heart, so it's still a good heart. The second is a jogger who's only 20 years old, just got run over on Putnam Avenue, and a very good heart. And the third, I have to mention this to you, just to be fair, but it was an 80-year-old fund of funds manager who just died of cirrhosis of the liver. He's also, just for your knowledge, he smoked 8 packs of cigarettes a day. Now, Mr. Collins, being a very wise man, looked at the doctor. The doctor said, which heart do you want? Mr. Collins said, well, it's very simple. I want the fund of funds manager. And the doctor's puzzled. He said, well, why? And he said, well, it's very simple. I want the heart that's never been used. So enough of our healthcare-related humor. Now on to these charts that I presented to you. These charts are not necessarily humorous if you've been investing in healthcare. To say it's an interesting time in healthcare is somewhat of an understatement, as Ron alluded to earlier. The chart number 1 presents an index that I have compiled that I've been keeping track of for years. I have 10 different healthcare sectors that I analyze graphically. In each sector, there's 10 companies. What I've done is compiled them all into a 100-company composite called the Oracle Healthcare Index, very creative name, and plotted that relative to the S&P 500. And what this chart depicts over a 10-year period is that in spite of the bull market that's been going on in technology and this NASDAQ and the internet, I'm thrilled to pull everybody away from CNBC just for an hour this morning. In spite of this bull market, healthcare's been in a bear market. And this bear market has largely been politically driven. Hillary, you might remember, did try to regulate the healthcare industry. They wanted to put in controls. They wanted to truly regulate and set prices. That failed. There was a brief relief rally in the 95-96 period, but what ensued really since then has been a systematic dismantling of essentially all the payment mechanisms throughout the healthcare system. Hospital payments have been cut. Home healthcare has been annihilated. Nursing homes have been put out of business. The Balanced Budget Act of 1997, which went into effect January 1, put 4 of the 10 nursing homes in our nursing home index out of business. I should say their equity out of business. One thing we know is nursing homes don't shut down. So there are interesting ways to invest in non-equity pieces of paper, such as REITs and high-yield debt. The bear market in this $1.5 trillion industry has been caused by several factors. Again, one is politics. And the worst of that is over. The Balanced Budget Reconciliation Act, the BRA, last year added back $15 billion to the Medicare program. The first time in my 21 years I've ever seen the government add back money to health care. We started actively buying healthcare service stocks last year. This year, given a $200 billion plus government surplus, they're going to start adding back more money to the healthcare system. So I think the political environment, quite opposite from what everybody seems to think. I think it's very positive in healthcare. I think the pendulum is swinging the other way. But the bear market continues at this point, but I think it's bottoming. Also, we've had some flow of funds, as I said, out of healthcare into technology. That's starting to come back. And from an economic point of view, I think this bear market is ending. We've had a very rapidly growing economy, and we all know what the goal of Alan Greenspan is. It's to slow the economy down. When the economy slows, when technology companies start slowing, the relative growth rates of healthcare become more attractive. And healthcare is very insensitive to general economic conditions. The second chart shows that there has been an area that did outperform for a while. That was the drug industry. It was the best performing healthcare sector. In fact, really the only sector from 1996 through 1999 that did okay. I think it was more people hiding in it in the drug sector. Last year, people panicked about Medicare reform, about potential price cuts. Those aren't good. There will be a Medicare drug benefit, we believe, over time, and Dr. Ventnor's been involved in a panel recently. He might be able to answer a question about that. But I think it's going to be very positive. It will add money to the Medicare program to seniors that aren't getting prescription drugs paid for. Over time, it could become somewhat regulatory in nature. But I don't expect that to happen for quite a while. I think it's another bullish event. The drug stocks are actually doing quite well. Now, at our fund, we focus on all areas of healthcare. As I said, we're diversified throughout the healthcare spectrum. It cushions the impact of investing in biotech sometimes. It also provides us great opportunities to be long the winners and short the losers. There's two areas of healthcare that are revolutionary today. One, we'll hear more about in a minute, biotechnology and genomics, clearly the greatest breakthrough in the history of medicine. The second, and I think is widely underappreciated, in my opinion, is the Internet. I think there's a revolution occurring. It's called Internet connectivity, and it's going to dramatically change the face of the healthcare landscape. It's the solution to healthcare cost containment problems. Jim Clark thought of the idea. He called it the golden triangle, where you connect the payers, the providers, and the patients on a real-time basis, information flow. And when you think about what the problem of the healthcare system is today, is that no one knows what anyone else is doing. The insurance companies don't know what the doctors are doing. The patients, who typically do whatever the doctor says anyways, don't understand. No one knows what the costs are. It's spun out of control. It's spawned an industry that's structurally flawed, called the HMO sector, which I predict will go out of business within the next 5 years. And I don't mean Cigna and Aetna are going bankrupt, but I think their strict HMO plans will disappear, and they'll go back to a very tightly managed indemnity plans where real-time online adjudication of healthcare occurs. Healthcare is a $1.5 trillion industry. About a third of that is fraud, abuse, and waste. This is going to revolutionize the industry. It's coming. The leading player is a company called Medical Manager. It's one of our largest holdings. It's selling well below asset value, and the reason is they're merging with Healthion, and Healthion stock has collapsed. So I expect some type of a restructuring of that deal in the near future. But this is an area that we're all going to see dramatic changes in. I have never seen a sector in healthcare, and perhaps in any part of the economy, that everyone hates, like HMOs. The politicians hate it. You and I, probably nobody here belongs to an HMO, but for the ones that do, we hate it. The physicians are withdrawing from all the programs, and as I said recently, once in a while when they quack up loud enough like ducks, and they are ducks, and this one's going to go away. And this connectivity business, which is potentially a $200 billion business-to-business and business-to-consumer opportunity, is going to revolutionize healthcare. On to biotechnology. This is clearly what we're talking about today. We are at really in the midst of what Rosemary and I have called the second stage, the second wave of biotech, where receptor-based drugs are in the marketplace. They're generating tens of billions of sales. They're generating billions of earnings, and stocks are starting to do well. They started to do well beginning in October last year, and then they collapsed in March. I think it's just instructive to look back. The chart 3 shows the relative performance of our biotech index for the last 10 years. You can see the end of what I call Wave 1, which ended in January 1992. And that was the first commercial sales of biotech. These are indigenous proteins like erythropoietin from Amgen, human growth hormone, that were identified, expressed outside the body, generated in quantity, and injected in people. That got a lot of excitement going. It spawned about 300 public companies. Most of them failed. And I think the analogy we're all going to be making a few years from now is the internet, how it's real. There's going to be a lot of successful companies, and there's going to be a lot of losers. I would expect to see a similar pattern of consolidation and some winners and some losers over the next few years. Beginning in 1997, receptor-based technologies started being introduced. And what that was, science had developed to the point where we now understood certain bodily processes such as inflammation, where we could block a tumor necrosis factor, block a part of the pathway of inflammation, or a free-floating receptor or another receptor. And this has spawned over 20 drugs in the marketplace. There's hundreds of receptor-based drugs in clinical trials, but it's a limited market. It's a market of potentially 400 or 500 targets, I think. 400 targets, and that's what all of biotechnology and most of the pharmaceutical industry has been about. It's identifying these pathways, blocking these receptors, turning them on, and stopping disease on a very specific basis. They're great drugs. They're all selling very well. Synagis from MedImmune, Rituxan from IDEC for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Enbrel from Immunex for arthritis. These are great drugs. But I think what spawned this rally, which we see beginning in October 1999, and then ending very abruptly on March 7th, was the realization that these companies have gotten very, very cheap again, companies with real product sales and earnings, and the realization that we are about to enter the third wave of biotech, and that is the genomics revolution. Dr. Ventnor here is leading the sequencing of the human genome. They're basically done. But people don't understand what that means. And he's here to tell you about it. I'm not going to try to explain it. But let's just say it's not the patent. The patents are not important of gene sequences. It's what's the function of these 80,000 genes and what are the 1 million different proteins that are produced. And when you think about it, this opens up the market for drug discovery, for diagnostics, for therapeutics, from 400 targets to 1 million. That's what the excitement's about. It's huge. This is the pot of gold. It doesn't get any more basic than this. It's going to be, again, Solera is creating the periodic table for drug development, for the human body, for the next millennium and more. And I don't think people understand the significance of this. Clearly somebody thought they understood it if you look at this genomics index. And it had a pretty spectacular increase. If you look closely, if you have a magnifying glass, that index has declined from 1,600 on March 7th to 400 yesterday. It's a 75% decline in the genomics index. So we have had a correction. I call it more, let's not use the term correction, let's use the term panic. But it's a real industry. So I don't think this is the end. This is the beginning of genomics. We've ended the top of the first inning. People are now sort of sorting out. Day traders don't know what they own. They're out of this sector. I've been studying this area all my life, and I've helped build an organization to attempt to understand it. But we're here, and it's different this time. You can invest in commercial entities. We're there, and I think now's the time to pass off to Dr. Ventnor to tell you what it's all about.
Thank you, Larry. That's the Warmup Act that Rolling Stones are going to have to retire. Although I can do a rendition, I can't get no satisfaction. A lot of people don't know what a genome is. Art Kaplan, the bioethicist who's on our advisory board, was dealing with human cloning legislation in Pennsylvania, and he took a poll amongst the legislature and asked them where their genome was. A third of them said it was in their brain. Another third said it was in their gonads. And the last third had no idea. What it actually is, and for those of you who are wondering where your genome is, it's in every one of your 100 trillion cells. That's why biology is in fact so complex. Every one of our cells has a complete copy of all of our chromosomes. Those chromosomes, all the genes, all the genetic material is what is defined as the genome. It has around 3.2 billion letters. And the letters are 4 different chemical bases, A, C, G, and T, so it's not hard to remember. But it presents a real problem in trying to decode it. So let me take it back in history a little bit, about a decade. In 1991, I published a paper describing the Est Method. This was because we couldn't interpret the genetic code, the little bits that we had at the time, and we decided to use our cells as our supercomputer, because every one of the cells in our body knows how to read our chromosome sequences and says, for the heart, we want these genes at this time of expression. For the brain, we want these genes. That really moved gene discovery forward. Now, it's hard to believe that basically 10 years ago, given all we knew about medicine, science, or what we thought we knew, was based on less than 2,000 human genes. The pharmaceutical industry today is based on around 400, as Larry said. So the vista of trying to understand all the biology is a really dramatic change in the overall thinking in science and in medicine. About 18 months ago, when we had announced the formation of Solera, the public Human Genome Project was really lagging. In fact, there was just a paper published in a news article in Science magazine saying it was way behind schedule and over budget, and the genome may be 10 or 15 years away, or it may never get done. A few years earlier, my institute published the first 3 genomes in history using a new method we developed called the whole genome shotgun method, which if there's questions on, I'd be happy to describe in a lot of detail for you. And what was then the PerkinElmer Corporation, PE Biosystems, my Funkenpiller's team developed a whole new instrument, the first completely automated DNA sequencer. And I got a call from Mike saying that they had this very dramatic new instrument and would I like to come see it. And by the way, they were thinking of putting up maybe $300 million to sequence the genome. I thought he was kidding at first. But when we went out and saw the new technology developed by his team, it was clear that it was truly revolutionary. And that combined with the approach that we developed, we worked out that we could probably sequence the human genome in 2 to 3 years, not the 15 or what was looking more like 20 or 25 years. To put this in context, I spent the first 10 years of my career trying to get one gene. I was working on a neurotransmitter receptor. I ended up honing the very first one from the human brain in the mid-1980s. And that's typically how biology is proceeded, is hundreds of scientists would converge on one protein, one gene. That's why we knew so few of them. And so the notion of getting all of them in a short period of time, I think was an overwhelming concept to everybody. I don't think anybody really realized till the data started coming out how overwhelming it was. So we formed Solera. It was spun off as a tracking stock. PerkinElmer changed its name to PE Corp. They sold a major division, the Analytical Instruments division, and they sold the PerkinElmer name to EG&G, which to add to the confusion changed their name to PerkinElmer. So if you want to invest in PE Biosystems or Solera, don't buy PerkinElmer stock. That won't get you very far. So there's now 2 tracking stocks, PEB and CRA, representing PE Biosystems and Solera. PE Biosystems makes the instruments and reagents. In Solera, we set out to be an information company on the vast amount of information that was being created. Things got going extremely well. We're well ahead of even our own very aggressive schedule. Just last month, we published the Drosophila genome, the fruit fly genome, which is the largest one that's been sequenced to date. The second largest one took about 15 years. The Drosophila genome took us less than 7 months. And it was part of the scale up towards getting human done. We've set up the largest sequencing factory in the world. We have 300 of these $300,000 machines that work automatically 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, creating more information in less than a year than has been created in the previous history of biology. In fact, that's the challenge in this field, is handling all the data, all the information. As a process we've built with partner compact computers based on their acquisition of Digital, the largest civilian supercomputer. Our database is now over 80 terabytes. I had to learn what the next thing up from a terabyte was. It's a petabyte. Our database will be over a petabyte within a year. And so when you listen to people talking about, well, is this going to be published or not? Just the sequence that we now have of the human genome, if we were to print it out at 8 font and filling every section of pages, it would be 100 feet taller than the Washington Monument just to print it. At the congressional hearing a few weeks ago, I was going to take a copy of the Receptor genome, which is about a stack of paper 5.5 feet tall, until the congressional committee told me anything you bring, you have to bring 120 copies of. So we brought them a stack of CD-ROMs instead. But they don't know how to reproduce CD-ROMs to a congressional factory with that. But we didn't have time, and somewhat being ecologically sensitive, I didn't want to chop down 1,000 trees just to make a point. This is a lot of information. We announced a couple weeks ago that we had finished the sequencing phase of the human genome. That means starting in September and finishing a couple weeks ago, we generated over 20 million sequences. We're now using our supercomputer to put this information back together, lining up the sequences of all the chromosomes. And as Larry said, that this is not the end of anything. It's truly the beginning. This was what we hoped to get to as the starting point of Solera. And we're just about to achieve that. It became an endpoint in people's eyes because all of us as taxpayers have been spending billions of dollars in what was supposed to be the biggest science project in history that required not only the might of the U.S. federal government spending about $3 or $4 billion over 15 or 20 years, but basically every government and every major charity in the world involving thousands of scientists over this long period of time. Some just fundamental technological and strategy changes changed that. So now with a group of 50 people, Solera has sequenced the human genome in less than a year. And so it is truly our starting point. We're starting to analyze that information. Our goal is to have fundamental knowledge. We still don't know how many human genes there are. You hear the estimates of 50 to 100,000. That tells you we don't have a very good idea if we can't work out within that range. We will know those numbers by the end of summer. But more importantly, in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, it's hard to develop drugs if you don't know all the targets. There's a great example early on with Tiger and HGS, where we found a new 7-transmembrane receptor that was worked out to be an epithelial receptor. HGS's partner, SmithKline Beecham, had a drug about ready to go into the clinic targeted to epithelial receptors. They had one or two of them, and so that's what they designed their drug against. At the last minute, they tested against this new receptor and found that, in fact, this new receptor was the one that was clinically relevant. They found out they had a better drug sitting on the shelf than the one that was about ready to go into the clinic that actually worked on the actual receptor. And that's now fairly far along. It's a point with human physiology. We have 80 to 100,000 genes, and the entire pharmaceutical industry has been looking at 400 collectively. It's not surprising that we have unusual side effects, or that we can't predict things, or that 1 out of 20 drugs that goes into clinical trials makes it through into the market. Genomics has a chance to dramatically alter all of that. At the time, the pharmaceutical industry has a challenge to increase their productivity 3 to 5-fold just to keep their growth rates at a constant level. That's why they're merging constantly to try and maintain that level. Having all the receptors, having all the proteins, starting to understand the pathways will for the first time allow us to know intellectually where to try to intervene. Having the complete repertoire of receptors that we'll be providing to the pharmaceutical industry in a matter of months will allow them, before a drug ever goes into the clinic, to test it in the laboratory against every receptor and predict the side effects before they ever go in, instead of having to do random experiments on us as guinea pigs. It's hard to predict physiology right now. This is the beginning of that era where we can go from the computer to trying to understand fundamental biology. But that's not going to happen overnight. Some of my colleagues have promised that within 10 years, every human disease will be cured and there'll be brilliant treatments for them. I'm not so sanguine about that. I've been saying it's going to take most of this century to understand the genetic code that we've just determined over the last few months. It's going to be 10 to 20 years before we have computers powerful enough to model our own physiologies of going from a single egg and a single sperm to 100 trillion cells coming out of that same single egg, single cell. Biology is very complex. It's not part of our genetic repertoire to understand it. Without supercomputers, the human brain is not equipped to understand its own physiology. This is a tremendous challenge. When I look at you and you look at me, I don't think you're thinking, gee, that's a nice set of 100 trillion cells. What you don't see is DNA and RNA. You see protein, and you see the results of protein interactions. One of our main purposes of having the human genetic code is to enable the field that we're now going to basically explode, and that's a field called proteomics. There's some very exciting new technology, again, from our sister company, PE Biosystems. We're building a facility to sequence 1 million proteins a day. As Larry said, if there's 80 to 100,000 genes, in each of us we have probably 1 million proteins. They're not all predictable from the genetic code. We have alternate splicing. A simple example we use is the insulin gene. The insulin gene makes a large protein that is cleaved by proteases in the body to create 4 separate proteins. 2 of those come back together to form the insulin molecule. The other 2 were thought to, for the last couple of decades, thought to be waste products. But recent studies in Stockholm have shown that these are actually hormones themselves. So one gene has yielded 4 proteins and 3 hormones. That's hard. We don't know the rules how to predict that from the genetic code. But having the genetic code allows us for the first time to comprehensively measure proteins. Other examples we've used is trying to understand metastatic cancer. We've been asked constantly, can we sequence all the genes in a metastatic breast cancer versus the normal tumor versus normal tissue? And the answer is yes, you can do that, but it doesn't really tell you anything. With the facility we're setting up, we're going to be able, in a matter of hours, to sequence all the proteins in a metastatic tumor and understand what's different with that expression. And with the pathway information, be able to feed that information to the pharmaceutical industry to know where to intervene to try and actually do something about cancer. With breast cancer, there's been no fundamental change in the survival rates in the last 3 decades. This information, understanding the complexity of cellular physiology, is our first real chance to try and understand and intervene with cancer. A key part of our proteomics effort is we're going to try and have antibodies made to every human protein. Right now, there's chip companies that try and measure RNA, gene expression companies. Why do we measure RNA? Because we can, because it's what we want to measure. In each cell, the DNA is the template. We make copies called messenger RNA that determine which proteins are expressed in that cell. But the RNA, we don't know the rules. It changes for every gene, every protein, every cell, how much protein is made from the RNA. So measuring the RNA gives us a very crude measure, but what we want to know directly is what happens with the protein. So we're going to be building protein chips from these antibodies that allow us to instantaneously essentially measure protein expression in different diseases, different physiological conditions. But imagine the complexity of this information as we build this network of a million proteins a day in different conditions being built across the complete genetic code. We envision within a few years having maybe 100 petabytes of data. This gets back to our basic goal as an information company. Nobody is equipped to handle this information. Our computer facility is about a $100 million computer facility. The pharmaceutical industry can't afford to build such facilities for analyzing the genome. We're having to scale it up tenfold now to deal with proteomics. You might have seen the announcement we just bought, Paracel Computing. They do custom designed computer chips. Every time you make an overseas phone call, a Paracel computer is being used by NSA on your telephone intercepts to work out whether you're talking about terrorist activities or not. These computers are ones we're going to be using for interpreting rapidly the genetic code and all the literature, all the information. So interpreting this information is almost beyond all of our imaginations. And I think you can see why we feel pretty positive about building this as an information company. We know that companies, anybody trying to develop and understand biology will need this kind of computing, this kind of information. I could talk for hours on these various subjects, but maybe that's a good place to sort of stop. We can talk about human genetic variation and SNPs. All of this is going to come together in a pretty complex way, but maybe this is a good time to stop and just go to the questions.
Now as kind of a focus toward the drug industry and creating molecules. Is it reasonable to think that before anything like that happens, there's a more straightforward application? This is in straight-out diagnostics of disease states?
Well, it's a good question. I think that was the paradigm that was sort of happening as so-called genes associated with genetic diseases were found. That the first step, such as with Huntington's disease, we don't really understand what the gene does. We don't understand how to intervene. At least we have a diagnostic. Now it's happening so fast, all these things are happening simultaneously. In fact, one of the biggest concerns that pharma companies have with these new targets is that the diagnostic and the therapeutic will come together, and that's with genetic variation. All of us in this room differ from each other in around 3 million letters of our genetic code. Some of those are more significant than others. Probably 90% of those have no real impact. But those minor differences will affect our responses to drugs. There was a major type 2 diabetes drug that was just taken off the market because roughly 1 in 10,000 people developed severe liver toxicity, and I think over 100 people died from the type 2 diabetes drugs. We think we can predict the genetic variants for those kinds of toxicities going forward. And so, in this case, a diagnostic or prognostic will determine who, in fact, can take the drug. And if there is such a test, we can develop one. Obviously, it would be mandated because, if you're going to take the drug and you had a 1 in 10,000 chance that it would kill you, you would certainly like to know that before you take it, because there are alternatives. So the diagnostic, the prognostics are going to go along with the therapeutics in a simultaneous fashion. They're going to determine which of us should get what drugs. What most people don't realize is most drugs only work on 30 to 50% of the population. The story that I tell is, people my age and older are told to take 1 baby aspirin a day to prevent heart attacks and stroke. What most people don't realize is that only applies to 1/3 of the population. And just one letter change in the genetic code of one gene determines whether you're one of the 3 that has the effect on. As a community, we say, well, everybody should take a baby aspirin a day because it's not easy to predict who the 1/3 is, and the side effects of aspirin are usually pretty minor for most people. Some people have severe side effects and allergies to them. But medicine is practice of sort of what's on average good for the population, which may be lethal to you personally. But on average, it's a great treatment. That's why we talk about individualized medicine, and that's Solera's ultimate goal, is to help each person understand their own genetic code and how that turns over the management of healthcare to you individually, not to people dealing with averages.
For those of us a little more obtuse, thinking of this from the business side, how do you get paid for all this work, and over what time frame?
It's an excellent question. Our initial model was we would get to the starting line, build this database, and then start to offer it commercially. And some early movers in the pharmaceutical industry recognized how critical this data was and how it was going to change what they do. Amgen, for example, signed up for a database subscription before we had our first sequencer delivered. Based on the reputation of my team and what they figured we would deliver. Our basic subscription is a $25 million subscription, locked in over 5 years. Most of them are much more than that. So we have over $200 million in committed revenue that people can't back out of over a 5-year period, just as we're getting to the starting line. I think we're still working out the answer to that question in terms of the constant expansion of this. We're in discussion with a large number of biotech companies and universities. People are realizing how critical this is. Our plan from the beginning was to publish the complete human genome when it was finished. And the question that I used to get from the beginning was, including from the CEO of the parent company, is now, tell me again how you're going to take our $300 million, you're going to sequence the human genome, you're going to give it away for free, and we're going to make money. He doesn't ask that question anymore because he does understand it, and that it's driving this information out there is beyond what anybody can use in any reasonable fashion. The physicists in the world said that I was playing a cruel hoax on people because I knew they couldn't possibly use the information. But it's not a hoax. We're trying to drive the information revolution. We gave away the Drosophila genome on a CD-ROM. It's 1/20th the size of the human genome, and it crashed most scientists' computers. They think, well, it's only 120 million letters, and I have a 5 gigabyte hard drive. It's no big deal. But there's tremendous differences in what you can use in an intelligent fashion in what our computers can actually deal with. People have much bigger computing problems in the sense of data storage than genomics and biology does. Banks have huge storage problems, data storage problems, and retrieval problems. The difference about genomics is we have to relate every single bit of information to every other bit of information. And that's, your bank account doesn't have to relate to mine. We don't cross-compare those in banks. But we have to compare every gene function. They just have to integrate because that's how biology works. So we think by putting this information out, it's going to increase the demand for the software, the computing services, our interpretation, because the amount of data in this field is already overwhelming anything that's ever happened in any other field. Mm-hmm. Bloomberg has, I think, over $1 billion a year revenue from their databasing and information services. It's not from having secret proprietary information. It's from having useful tools that help people to retrieve information very quickly and help them understand it quickly. That's going to be even a bigger challenge in this field. So we see a constant expansion of our subscription base, even though we're just now getting to the starting line and beginning to develop that. Trying to deliver this amount of information over the internet. I agree with Larry, the internet is the critical phase with this. We're fundamentally an internet company. We're delivering all the information to the pharmaceutical companies over virtual private networks. Some of them didn't even understand this issue early on. One of them, halfway through the first year, decided they would like to do faster searches, and they thought they could do them faster on their own computers. And one company tried to download the database over their high-speed direct link. 6 days later, they screened for us to shut off the computer. I think they only got 10% through it, and it was, they just had no idea the size and the complexity of it. So we think as more and more people need to understand this information, that model will expand tremendously. The proteomics side is going to lead, we think, to direct cancer vaccines. It's going to lead to new diagnostics, new ways to look at medicine. If we can sequence 1 million proteins a day, we will be adding to the complexity of medicine, but at the same time simplifying it as we get down to what is really changing with disease, and at the same time providing a target where to attack. So it's information, it's products, hopefully cancer vaccines. We haven't even talked about the agricultural side, but we could describe the genetics of what you're eating this morning, if we'd like to.
Can I ask a question? There's a big issue of intellectual property in this whole sector. And, we all, I think the world understands now that gene sequences without function attached are not patentable.
Well, I wish that was true. Some companies are downloading public data from the internet every night, doing a quick computer search and filing patents. And I think most people realize it's really an abuse of the patent system. And so these companies that have based they're betting everything on their intellectual property portfolio, I think will end up losing. If you look at issued patents and if they have the word "like" in the title, that means they have no idea what the function is. It's an insulin-like gene. This means that was the insulin molecule was the closest match in the database. And patents are being issued on that. If you look at HGS and Insight, most of their patent portfolio has the word "like" in the title of each application. And I think that's what people are really objecting to, and Solera is totally in agreement with the National Institutes of Health. The bar should be extremely. It should be as the way you described it. You need to know the function, the application. Most people in the pharmaceutical industry don't want these early patents. The Amgens of the world think that's the worst possible thing because of a patent life on erythropoietin or a genome CSF is shortened because of some companies just trying to do early speculative patenting. It actually hurts the patent life that they have for a real drug. So there is a lot of confusion on this. There are companies really trying to abuse the system. But I think as there was a so-called correction in the market, there'll be an even bigger correction in the patent law in the near future.
But I was leading, obviously there's a lot of gray area around this whole intellectual property with gene sequences. Where your company seems to be going is proteomics. It's combined with PE biosystem systems and the investment you're making, you're going to be way out in front of everyone in proteins. Proteins are patentable. And my question is why be an information company and sell? I can see selling genomic information, but why sell protein information? Why not keep it for the own account?
Well, in fact, with the protein area, we're going to be developing both. But our goal is not to become a direct pharmaceutical company. I think that's sort of the classic biotech model where you drag things out for 10 or 15 years, promising that someday you'll have a billion-dollar drug. With key new hormones that we discover, we will patent those, and we will license those to the pharmaceutical industry, hopefully for very favorable terms to Solera.
So this will be royalty
with long-term royalties. We have a pre-existing agreement with Amgen for genes that we discover, so proteins that anyone that they take into their programs would pay us tens of millions of dollars in milestones, and then nice royalties if it becomes an actual product. But you're right, the protein area will yield this much faster. Important diagnostics, markers. The example I use a lot is colon cancer. About 5 years ago, along with Bert Vogelstein, we discovered 3 new genes that cause colon cancer. And this is part of the personalized medicine repertoire in terms of by understanding your own genetic code, we can predict whether you have a greatly increased chance of getting colon cancer. Instead of that being bad news, it's good news because it gives you control over your lives. Right now, you're told at age 50 to go get your first colonoscopy. It's amongst the other great news you get by turning 50. It seems to be very fitting. That if you know you have an increased risk of getting colon cancer, you don't wait till age 50 to get a colonoscopy, because colon cancer is essentially 100% treatable or curable if it's caught early enough. This is where proteomics is going to come in, and we have hope that it will replace the colonoscopy, so it will be even more favorably received. Is that if we find protein expression changes, we hope to come up with PSA equivalents for colon cancer for other diseases, that if you know you have an increased risk, then you get this blood test more often like you do with PSA tests. So proteomics, I think, is going to lead to new and better diagnostics, predictors, direct therapeutics. But I think the area that is probably going to be the biggest growth area in the pharmaceutical industry is going to be vaccines and personalized vaccines. This has been a slow area to build, but having all the proteins, understanding cancer, unfortunately or fortunately, the protein sequences in all of us are subtly different. That's where the SNPs, the genetic variation, come in. And that's where personalized vaccines come in. Because if you have a protein that's overexpressed in a tumor, that's going to be a slightly different antigen than the person sitting next to you would have, quite possibly. And so by being able to rapidly with DNA vaccines, or even having a repertoire, we just pull them off the shelf to different epitopes. We could have instantaneous vaccines that may not work on anybody else, but would work on your particular tumor. So we are going to drive things in that direction, but the information part of the business is a very essential part for everything. But we're not limiting ourselves to that.
Dr. Ventner and Larry, one of the criticisms of this industry, investing in this industry, has been that it's been overregulated. What, if any, of the policy implications or the regulatory implications that you see coming down the pipe in regard to your area, and would you comment?
Well, maybe I can comment first. I think in terms of biotechnology, the concerns are more a fear, this rush to ban human cloning without anybody understanding what that was or whether it was even serious. I think that was the impact of the Clinton-Blair statement, not anything else. There was nothing they said that I particularly disagreed with. I think the fact that they were saying anything scared people that it might be an indication of new regulations coming. Yeah, it was sort of an irrational response. But it was puzzling that they were saying anything at all. I don't think there's that much in the way of regulation right now. Some is not bad. Maybe Larry's aware of areas where we have to be much more concerned with it.
Well, my experience in biotech investing is that now that the Unabomber's been arrested, the government has to do the regulation for the genetics company. Seriously, we used to own a company when I was about 2 partners. We were the largest shareholder in a company called Genetic Therapy Inc., French Anderson, who I'm sure you know. And they were getting death threats every day, and it was. So it's now the government's turn. I think there's this fear of Big Brother's going to be genotyping you everywhere you go and looking at your entire chromosome and your entire genetic repertoire and deciding whether you can enter this movie theater or not, which is absurd. But that's the kind of privacy issues that are out there, and I think they're just noise and irrelevant. And probably the biggest fears that are real that are difficult for me to address, but it's more agricultural, where products are getting into the marketplace, where there is a fear of what could happen.
I think the privacy concerns are not. I certainly have them myself. I think our goal as we genotype people, there's only one source that we think should own that information. If we genotype you, you should be the only one that has the key to that information. That's not the way the rules work right now. Any of you, if you recently applied for life insurance or health insurance, there's these little tiny clauses at the bottom of the page that say even if you paid for the information yourself, it's any information you have about your own health, you have to provide that to your insurance company. So I think that, we're urging stronger legislation in the privacy area so that it can't be mandated that if you, on your own, or even with a third-party payer, have a genetic test done, that information can't be used against you. It has tremendous power if you own it. We don't want large government databases of our genetic codes. I don't think we want large databases of private companies with the genetic code. Our view is that each individual should have that information and use it in conjunction with their physicians. But it's not hard to come up with HMO scenarios of people wanting to misuse the information as a means of rationing healthcare. So I think it's an area we do have to be cautious with. I think the GMO stuff is an emotional crisis. We don't want to. That's my biggest concern, is that if that comes into the healthcare arena, because people are discriminated against based on this information, then we'll all lose.
Question for both of you. No one knows, but both of you must have extremely educated guesses about the pace of, or the time frame of these advances that we've talked about in various areas. And if you could just express that, each of you, in some of the primary areas, how, in a range of years, I'm sure that'd be very interesting.
Let me take a stab at that, and then I'll let Larry think about my answer while I'm doing it. Things are changing very rapidly. I'm supposed to be a good foreseer of the future. But quite honestly, 24 months ago, if you'd asked me, could we possibly be where we are today, I would have told you no. There was very little chance of that. We're in one of these rare moments in history where things are changing at such an exponential pace. It's very difficult to predict the timeline for things. I'm fairly certain what will happen in the future, but I can't predict the time for it. I'm certain that not too distant future, before any baby that leaves the hospital, is born in the hospital, that their parents will have a DVD disc or whatever the media is at the time with their child's genetic code, trying to predict their health future and determining which drugs they can get and what they can't get, what diseases they'll be susceptible to, which ones they won't. I can't tell you whether that's going to be in 5 years or 15 years right now. If anything, any timeline that people have, we can probably expect those things to move up a lot faster, except the things that involve fundamental basic discovery. Really trying to understand how cancer works is impossible to predict. The breakthrough could come tomorrow with this information. It could take the next 30 years. There's real uncertainty with this. The one certain thing is that it's coming.
I think my comment would be that they're clear the major breakthroughs, such as Solera is working on, that take time, and I think certainly this is the most qualified person in the world to tell you about it. But there are genomic products already on the market. Viral infections are being genotyped right now. AIDS patients are getting the sequence of their AIDS infection, their entire genomic sequence being genotyped, looking for mutations, and getting custom tailored drug therapy today. We're invested in some of these companies. SNP companies are starting to do analyses of single nucleotide polymorphisms, minor changes. And as they get uncovered at a little company called Orchid Computer that has a panel of 11, a cardiovascular panel with 11 variations today, and that could grow to hundreds. I don't know how many he could explain, but we are starting to determine, Herceptin for breast cancer. Is a woman HER2 positive or not? Can they be treated with this drug? These are events that are here. It's stimulating the pathology business, where we're heavily invested in public companies. So the early stages of it are already being felt commercially.
There's been an enormous number of new biotech companies created, and particularly genomics companies. Do you see a wave of consolidation coming, and do you anticipate Solera being a part of that?
I was asked that question yesterday on Bloomberg, and I got a little bit of trouble for my answer. some companies you see changing their names to genomics just to try and get on this bandwagon, which is, I agree with Larry's comments about the sophistication of some of the investing is actually disturbing to people like myself that know what some of these companies have and what they don't have. And there were some that were close to going out of business that went up tenfold in market cap, riding this wave up and down because they were proven not to have anything over time. Will there be a consolidation? I think the response to the Clinton-Bear statement guarantees that. I think there were, 100 companies that were getting ready to do IPOs. Some of those companies need money desperately, and they're going to have trouble going out now and getting that money. So I think some will go out of business. There's always mergers taking place in this area. Solera's in a strong position for a company that's 18 months old. We have a good currency despite the sharp ups and downs, and we have the capital in the bank. We have over $1 billion cash in the bank to build the next phase of what we're doing. We don't want to be a consolidator for the sake of doing that. We're trying to build our platforms in a rapid, rational fashion. And like any other group now, we're making buy versus build decisions. And we're trying to do that in a rational fashion.
Yeah. Does the public genome sequencing effort pose any threat to your business model?
Only in the sense some of the statements that are coming out of some of the people associated with that. The data itself is actually quite I think people are in an awkward position of, feeling they're having to defend their large budgets that have been going on over a large period of time, and some of those would like to keep those budgets going. The data itself, we're incorporating it and trying to get a highly accurate sequence even that much sooner. The question is sort of based on the previous view of genomics companies. HGS and Insight built their models on secrecy, and that if you wanted to see what they had, you had to buy in. And I guess that was why there was some doubt whether we would publish our data in the first place. But I think our model is we will drive far more in this field by having the data be out there. So anybody else generating human genomic data only helps our situation. It doesn't hurt it. But if you were a company that had a proprietary database on ESTs, by the end of this year, that database will have no value based on both the Solera effort and the public effort. I think, our view is the faster people generate data and put it out, the more demand it will create for our kinds of interpretation and computational capabilities. So not only does it not pose a threat, it's helped us tremendously and it's helped take even a year off our aggressive schedule.
Sort of a follow-up to that question, maybe a little technical question, though, is you got a lot of credit and moved the field faster by doing this jamboree of annotation around Drosophila. And some people say that it's going to be a lot harder to do that with humans because there's more people doing annotation with in the human genome, and it's a more fragmented community. Is it your intent to do the same thing on the human genome, and or do you see any kind of limitations in what you're going to be able to do compared to Drosophila?
That's a very sophisticated question.
I may be the only scientist in the room, right?
Let me describe a little bit about what she was referring to in terms of with the Drosophila genome. We decided instead of the previous 14 genomes and chromosomes that my team had sequenced it and published at Tiger, where we had a dedicated team trying to sort through them, we decided that this represented a unique situation with. We brought in experts from around the world with the different gene families, people that knew receptors, ion channels, the Methuselah genes, and we had them literally camp out at Solera for several weeks. And they worked day and night until the genome, the initial annotation was done. In some senses, yes, it was easier because there was a cohesive community around Drosophila. There's roughly 6,000 researchers in the world. that devote their careers to studying Drosophila, and they really knew some of these families tremendously. That there is no human genetics community per se. You know, in fact, it's really a balkanized state of science because anybody that works in human genetics views everybody else in human genetics as their public enemy. Something I didn't realize until I shifted from Drosophila to human. But we're going to do the same thing. We're having a major annotation jamboree. In a way, it's actually going to be easier. We plan to start that early this summer because there's been so much excitement. We've had top Nobel laureates and top scientists from around the world calling and volunteering to help deal with their gene family of choice. And so, in fact, I think it's going to be a very exciting process that probably all of you will be able to follow along. We've had as many requests from the press as we have from scientists to come participate in that. And I think it's going to be, you know, with the Drosophila genome, people got so excited because basically every hour they made more discoveries than they made in the rest of their careers. And I think that will happen with the initial annotation of the human genome. The human genome, in fact, is going to be a lot easier because we've already done Drosophila. And while it's not very flattering, we're just about 4 times the equivalent of a fruit fly. You know, the Drosophila scientists think they're fruit flies are humans with wings. You know, I think it's a key part of understanding how this information goes forward and why we do things like the Drosophila. You can take any human gene and substitute it in Drosophila for the Drosophila gene, and it works totally normally. The experiments usually are not done in the opposite direction. But they have been done in human cells. So in cells and culture, you can substitute a human gene with a fruit fly gene, and they work. You know, we are a product of evolution, and that's why this area is so powerful. So we will be doing a major annotation jamboree for human, and I think it will be more information coming out in a very short period of time than has ever happened before in history, and I think we'll be very excited about that.
Question for Larry, really. A large reason a lot of the volatility in this sector this year has been just investors' misunderstanding on where to capitalize from the genomics revolution. As Dr. Venter explained, the interpretation of the mapping is going to take so long. Where would you as a portfolio manager look to capitalize, and what's the time frame?
Well, I think given what's gone on in biotech, what's interesting now is we can go back to where we were a year or two ago, and that's investing in companies without what I call scientific risk. There was a point in time in the late 80s, early 90s, where you had to buy everything because everything went up. Somebody had a good phase 2 or phase 1 study would go up. And then over this 7-year bear market we had until last year, nothing would go up even if they got a product approved. And you could buy it and it'd be cheap and you wait for sales and earnings and eventually stocks will go up. For the most part, we're back to these valuation levels. So what we are focusing on, we've narrowed down our number of names in the portfolio, in our biotech portfolio in particular. And we're focusing on companies that don't have scientific risks, that are launching products, or that have platform technologies such as Solera, where you have to look at a reasonable assessment of discounted cash flow. What's interesting, you can't afford a failure in this market because in a bearish phase in a sector like biotech, if you get anything that smells wrong, they collapse, and everybody wants that all at once. It's fairly instructive. A company like Immunex, which has a product Enbrel that could potentially be a $2 or $3 billion product, and other products coming, in our discounted cash flow models, is grossly undervalued, even though the stock's up substantially. And I think if we can put a reasonable DCF model to Solera, given the enormous upside, particularly in out years, you can come up with just massive numbers. So the good thing also on Solera is they don't have any products that are going to fail in the near term, so we don't have to worry about that. One more question.
Question to the e-healthcare space. We haven't heard much about that yet. Where do you see this going? Companies like Healthy and Remedy, not only in the US but also in other economies, say the second largest, Japan or so?
Well, I think basically over time with respect to genomics, I think you're going to have a portal probably from Solera going into every doctor's office in the world. That's further out. The space of e-health today has been two separate sectors. It's been consumer-driven content companies where you go in to get, to look up a disease state. They're incredibly uneconomic. They make no business sense. They're waiting for the drug companies to fund them. And even if you have the ex-surgeon general on your board, it doesn't necessarily work, and they're in tailspins and they're going out of business, many of them. The business that I think is revolutionary is the business-to-business e-health, quote, connectivity area, which I alluded to earlier. There are several franchises in the industry. Healthy on WebMD came up with some of the original ideas, but quite frankly, it's internet people trying to get in the healthcare space that have no clinical focus, no understanding of what people are looking for. It's very consumer-centric, very consumer-focused. Companies like Medical Manager, IDX Corp are very clinically driven. And what I see happening is the clinical aspects of healthcare being integrated into the financial aspects of running a doctor's office. So I think the winners are those companies that have the platforms in the doctor's office today. Like I have a Bloomberg on my desk in the office, and I want different portals to come in to bring in options or to bring in other information sources or Reuters or whatever. There are two large players. One is Medical Manager, which is scheduled to merge with Healthion, although we're not in the book for it. And I think many other large shareholders are not. It's selling at $30 a share. It's got a hard asset value, let's say a breakup value of over $80 a share right now if it were liquidated. They have 30% of the doctor's office desktops in North America. So 30% of the doctor's offices have Medical Managers. They're using their financial applications, and they're integrating now in their clinical applications. The other large player is IDX Corp, which we own, which has another 25% of the U.S. physician's office market, particularly larger clinics, Mayo Clinic type of setups, and they are rolling out their own connectivity piece. It's more physician-centric than payer-centric. They're more setting up websites for doctors to schedule appointments, to communicate with individuals. But I think this opportunity, it's the solution, the real-time adjudication of claims, the protocol. If somebody comes in with diabetes and Dr. Smith decides to treat a person that way, he needs to get on real time with that map to figure out which protocol they approve, which drugs they approve, and what other therapies or what other formularies to follow if he wants to get paid. And physicians, they're having a minor problem with HMOs. It's called not getting paid.
Just before we wrap up, let me hand it over to Steve for a few comments. Thanks, Ron.
I'd like to thank Larry for introducing us to Craig Beck. Thank you, Larry. I can't help but get a sense of history. We're sitting here 3 years ago. Jeff Tarrant sitting on this panel. Jeff, I'm about to embarrass you again. But we had a fellow named David Weatherill who no one had ever heard of before. David went on to tell us about something called College Marketing, which went on to become CMG. I think this is another one of those panels. So thank you. It's a special meaning for me, especially since Oldfest is now the sponsor of this venue. We've been threatening to go beyond the boundaries of Greenwich, and now we can by webcasting this. So I want to welcome everyone who is watching this webcast, or at least who's tuning in across the country. We're going to be doing this quite a bit. I would like to welcome some new people to the group. Jim Park, are you here? I guess he's not. He's from the World Bank and might not have been able to cross the picket lines. That's right. Betty Sheets, Joan Young, Karen Cook, welcome to our group. Bruce Hamlet, Suzanne Shute, and Celia Radford, welcome to our group. If you've noticed, some of you have called us and said you're not getting your invitation, you're not off the list. You're not off the list. We've just gone to going out over email. So if you can, get us your email address and you'll get your invitation a lot faster, and we'll be able to respond to you, as well as give you some of the summaries of the roundtables as they go forward. So we're trying to turn this into a little bit of an electronic form. Thank you, roundtable.
If I could just offer a quick conclusion. Enrico Fermi attended a lecture of one of his colleagues, and he sent him a note afterwards, in which he said, I was confused about your topic before your lecture, and I'm still confused now on a higher level. I think if Enrico Fermi was here today, he would say, Eureka, I'm 4 times more complex than Jerome. So thank you very much.